opening your Bibles, tonight we're going to begin in 2 Kings chapter 21. 2 Kings chapter 21, where we're getting closer to the end of the nation of Judah. As we noted last week, because of the wickedness that was instigated in that nation by King Manasseh, we find that any hope of that kingdom being sustained for any length of time has now been lost. Even though King Manasseh made some changes later in his life, even though he humbled himself and turned away from the wickedness that he was engaged in, he had so led that nation into wickedness so far away from God that God's wrath would not be abated. Punishment was going to have to come upon that nation. But we're going to find that 6 more kings are going to reign before ultimately Judah is going to fall to Babylon. Well, after the death of King Manasseh, his son, a man by the name of Amon, he becomes king at the age of 22 years. But he would only reign for a period of 2 years, as we see there in 2 Kings 21 and verse 19. Verse 20 says that Amon did evil in the sight of the Lord as his father Manasseh had done. He walked in the ways of his father, serving and worshiping the idol gods that his father had worshipped. But we find that unlike his father, he never reached a point of repenting. He never reached a point of turning back to God. Throughout his life, he continued this practice of wickedness and continued carrying that nation farther and farther away from God. 2 Chronicles 33 and verse 23 tells us that rather than repent, rather than change, rather than humble himself before the Lord, the text says that he multiplied his guilt, meaning he continued to engage in more and more wickedness, more and more sinful activity. So rather than correcting the errors that were wrong, he just exacerbated the problem, made it worse and worse. 2 Kings 21:22 shows us that Amon essentially abandoned God. Abandoned God's will and did not follow after the Lord's way or after the instructions of God. He followed after his own desires and he worshipped these false gods. Well, after just a very short reign, remember I said that he reigned for a period of 2 years. Several of his servants got this idea in mind that because Amon was leading that nation in such a negative fashion, since he was leading them so far away from God, they conspired among themselves that they were going to put him to death. And we find that what these men did, they killed the king, thinking that this was going to draw the praise of the people. Thinking that those in that kingdom were going to be happy with what had happened, that they were going to be celebrated for this task that they had performed. That's not how the nation saw it. The nation essentially saw it in the way they should have saw it. These men committed murder. They murdered the rightful king. Instead of an act of justice, these men believed that they were doing something good, that it was a just action that they were carrying out. This man was evil, and they were simply bringing that evil to an end. But the nation didn't see it that way. And it says that they executed all of those who had conspired against King Amon. They lost their life because of this deed that they had engaged in. And at the death of Amon, Amon's son, a man by the name of Josiah, a man that we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about, Josiah was named king in Amon's place. And the Bible tells us that Amon's deeds were recorded and that he was buried alongside his father in the garden of Uzzah. So very, very little information is recorded about this man. In fact, I believe there's only 6 verses of information that's recorded about this man. So what are a couple of applications that we see from his life? Well, first and foremost, don't continue in your ancestors' bad habits. You know, here was a man who could have gone a couple of ways. He had his father Manasseh. The early years of his life were devoted to great wickedness, but he changed. He turned back to God later in life. Now, Amon, he could have looked at his father as an example in a couple of different ways. He could have looked at the negative, or he could have looked at the positive. Well, notice what he did. He focused in upon the negative. The wickedness that his father had engaged in. Amon, he learned a lesson from his father, but he learned the wrong lesson. He continued in the bad habits rather than in that good example. You know, it's very similar to a message that Daniel relays to King Belshazzar about his ancestor, King Nebuchadnezzar. And we find this message in Daniel chapter 5, verses 18 through 23. And I want you to listen to this message. It says, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Now you remember, God was the one who allowed Nebuchadnezzar to rise to power so that he would be able to go in and to conquer Judah and to oppress them as a form of punishment. God was the one who allowed that to happen. So hence, notice what Daniel is saying to the predecessor to, or the successor, to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, you know, your father, he had a kingdom, he had majesty, he had glory, he had honor. God's the one that allowed him to have this. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Is this not a message that could have been delivered to Amon almost word for word? He says, you know what? God is the one who allowed your father to have the position that he had, that let him grow in prominence and strength and gave him this kingdom to oversee. And yes, it reached a point where due to wickedness, he had to be put in his place. He had to be knocked down. He says, but your father saw the error of his ways. Your father changed. But notice the next statement, and you knew that. You saw all of that. But yet you did not follow that example. You continued in the wickedness. You didn't follow his example. And so we find that the most important lesson to be learned, not only from this example from Nebuchadnezzar's life, but also from the life of Manasseh, it fell on deaf ears. The lesson from Nebuchadnezzar's life, Belshazzar was deaf to that message. Amon was deaf to the message from the life of Manasseh. But then another application, and this is one we've already touched on just briefly. And that is, murder is not justice. Murder is not justice. Notice I did not say taking a life is not justice. Murder is not justice. And let me expound upon that just a little bit. Under the law of Moses, was there a death penalty? Yes. Under the law of Moses, there was a death penalty for many, many different things. But whenever you look at the law of Moses, you find that due process of law had to be carried out. For example, in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 20, we're told that the worship of false gods brought about a punishment of death. But it wasn't such where a person could just be taken out and put to death without them having a trial, without witnesses, without any type of due process of law taking place. We see in Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 20, and also Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15, where the law of Moses clearly established the laws that had to be followed in order to carry that out. Now, these servants of Amon, did they follow due process of law? No. They simply took it upon themselves, thought that they were doing something that was good, but in the process, they broke the law of Moses. They committed murder rather than carrying out justice in the proper fashion. We might say they resorted to a vigilante form of justice. And as a result of that, their actions were unlawful. It wasn't acceptable to God. And so instead of being honored and praised and celebrated, they were killed for their crime. Now, this is very similar to another account that we see back in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. You may remember King Saul has been killed on the field of battle. And a young man comes to David. And he tells David that Saul is dead, and essentially he makes it out as if he's the one that has killed Saul. Why did he come and make up this story and tell David that? Because in his mind, Saul was the enemy of David. And if David found out that Saul had died, in his mind, what did he think? He thought he would be praised. David's going to think, I've done something good. Do you remember the action that David took? This young man was put to death because, as the text said, he had killed the Lord's anointed king. He had not followed due process of law. And even though he did not actually have a hand in bringing about the death of Saul, he lied about it. He made up a story. And he came and he passed it off as if he was the murderer. As a result of that, he lost his life. But what this shows us is that even if a person is guilty of some type of terrible crime, unlawfully taking action against that person, whether it's death or whether it's some type of oppression or some type of beating, whatever the case may be, if we carry out some type of action against that person without giving them due process of law, then we are the ones who are just as much in the wrong as they are. Because we too have broken the law. What this tells us is that we are never justified in doing something wrong.
Josh, didn't God say that He hated the shedding of the hands of those that shed innocent blood?
That's right. That's right. And if they did not have due process of law, how would they know if they were guilty or innocent? And so absolutely, God hates the shedding of innocent blood. And you know, that's part of the reason why David wasn't allowed to build the temple, because it talked about he had shed innocent blood. So, I mean, you see, there were repercussions there for those things. Blake?
How would this work in cases of self-defense?
Well, I mean, self-defense is a little bit different. I mean, this is talking about instances where, you know, people have what we might say premeditated. They stop and they think about it. They plan these things out. And we have instances that we read about in the Bible of things taking place that we might refer to as self-defense. But what this is talking about in this case is where, yes, Amon had done things that was sinful, but he had never been brought to law about those things. It was vigilante justice, yes. I mean, they had lashed out against him without due cause. And so if it was a situation, you turn this around and say Amon had attacked them and they fought him off and he lost his life as a result of it, that wasn't them trying to carry out justice. That was them trying to protect themselves. And so we see a difference in that situation there. Now, I know that there are people who have different opinions on things such as self-defense and things of that matter, and everybody certainly has their right to their own opinion on different matters like that. But the message that we're talking about here is when due process of law is usurped. When a person should have been brought to trial or should have been brought to face the authorities for what they've done, but rather than taking that step, you simply carry out some type of punishment against them. And so that's where we see this situation here being brought about. So even if we believe that it's going to accomplish some type of a good purpose, as these men did, we cannot go against God's law. We cannot usurp that authority. Okay, any other questions or comments on Amon? Well, that's that very, very little information is recorded about this man.